Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I'm just drinking my morning coffee and getting ready to get my day started, get some squats going. And I thought I would talk to you guys a little bit about how technique, when you use technique on basic lifts, we're not talking about really complicated lifts like power cleans or full snatches and things like that, or the clean and jerk. I'm talking about basic exercises. Things like a barbell squat, a deadlift, an overhead press, a chin up, a bench press, right? Basic exercises. The topic comes up of what happens when you use technique, changes in technique to lift more weight. Does it negatively or positively affect muscle growth? Does it affect muscle fiber activation, things like that? Because I had someone say, hey, I'm really concerned. This is one of the first comments I woke up to this morning. They mentioned something with like Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum saying he spent a lot of time working on different positions on the overhead press so that he could lift the most weight. And he goes, and I just feel that's not true fitness to me. Fitness should be about stimulating growth and adaptation. And it was something like that not just cheating to lift more weight. And let's step back and assess that, because there's a couple different things when it comes to these big lifts that you can do to lift more weight. Some of them have the potential for ideal muscle fiber activation, and then others reduce activation. And if you reduce total muscle fiber activation, obviously you have the less potential to stimulate muscle growth. But we're going to get into that because there's a difference between using technique while you're keeping the exercise basically the same. And I'm going to get very, very detailed into that. All right. A lot of times when people think of technique being used to lift more weight, it generally has to do with either shortening the range of motion or changing the lever arms through a movement so that you can put less tension on muscles through certain points in the range of motion so that you can use the same amount of force to push more weight. Now, and a lot of people say, aha, so that would always make it easier, so you're going to get less muscle fiber activation. Well, no, not always. It depends on how you go about doing it and if you actually adjust the weight accordingly. Now, anytime you start reducing range of motion, you start reducing the potential for muscle fiber activation. And it's not just because of the less work done. Now, obviously, because there's less work done, right? Perfect example. Let's say you cut the range of motion in half on a deadlift by doing a rack pull just above the knee, right? Classic example we talk about. How about if you arch a lot on your bench press, you bring the grip out a little wider and you get a really big arch because you have a really flexible back and you can cut your range of motion in half. Now there's another example that doesn't always get mentioned. Both of those allow you to lift more weight by reducing the range of motion. Well, when you reduce range of motion, you reduce work done. But a lot of people would say, well, okay, so yeah, you're doing less work, so therefore it's easier, so less muscle fibers. Well, no, not if you increase the weight accordingly. In other words, if you take your 500-pound deadlift and you cut the range of motion in half like that and you pull 800 pounds, yeah, if you pull 800 pounds, well, they're still pretty similar. You're getting into similar amounts of work done per second and all of that. Potentially, depends on how fast the bar is moving and everything. Same thing on the bench press. Yeah, you could add more weight though. It's not like you're taking your 300 pounds that you would do flat back and still just doing 300 pounds with a big arch. You're doing that to lift more weight. So in terms of those joint angles, the muscle fiber activation stays the same through those joint angles because you're capable of lifting a lot more weight because you've changed the moment arms. So the activation stays the same as long as the rate of perceived exertion is similar. In other words, a 1 rep max, a 5 rep max, whatever. If you're reaching the same percentages or getting within 1 rep of failure on both, it doesn't matter. You're getting similar activation through those ranges of motion. However, because there are muscle fibers that do not activate throughout the entire range of motion in any given muscle, there are muscle fibers that tend to be limited to just certain joint angles, right? And you have some muscle fibers that can activate at any joint angle in the muscle and some that only activate, even in a more simple muscle like a bicep or a pec, that only activate at certain joint angles. So you're reducing the total potential for muscle growth. You're reducing the total potential for muscle fiber activation. It's not by an enormous amount, and people need to understand that. It doesn't mean that it's only half the muscles, and I want to make that clear. We're talking about something like when you start cutting half the range of motion out, maybe 4 or 5% of the total muscle fibers. And I'm throwing that out there arbitrarily, just a ballpark. You're losing a few percentages of the total potential muscle growth, right? It's not an enormous difference, but it does matter if you're trying to get as big as possible, right? Because you're not having access to all of them. So what happens when we come over to using other techniques? How about when we're keeping the range of motion the same and we're adjusting bar paths, or we use a bar path that allows more muscles to come into play? Because that's your two methods by which you can adjust technique in a way while keeping range of motion similar. Allows better leverages. And a perfect example, how about the overhead press? You guys have seen me getting pretty strong on the overhead press. I mean, it's not the best in the world, but I think enough people out there going, there are many people who can strict press 225, especially from a dead stop on the chest, which is what I do. Perfect example. This is a perfect example of adjusting bar path to get better leverages. I pull the bar in really tight. When I touch my chest, people need to understand, you're not seeing the side view, I'm touching right here. I'm touching my clavicle. I'm not touching further out. I'm keeping it pulled in really tight. I'm pulling my head back so that I can get right here and drive up in a straight line and then push my head forward as it goes up, right? So what happens? All the moment arms and everything change to where there's less side loading. Everything is more upright, and I'm getting favorable leverage advantages by doing that. In other words, if I didn't pull it as far back, I could probably only do 215. Like if I didn't use that exact bar path that I have found, my 225 overhead presses would probably only be 215. I bet you I get 10 pounds out of that, right? Get 10 pounds out of it with the same amount of muscle fiber activation. So I'm not activating less muscle fibers because I'm lifting more weight using slightly more favorable leverages, but still moving everything through the same range of motions, because allowing the bar to drift out certain ways puts different muscles, because of the bone angles and the lever arms, puts them at slightly unfavorable positions through a certain part of the range of motion, in this case near the bottom, right? Near the bottom. So, or at least up to about the face, maybe about the eyes, because of the way I'm doing it. And beyond that, it's the exact same exercise. So hopefully I have enough momentum going through the bottom that I can drive through with a weight I would, with a heavier weight than I would normally be able to push through that, because I've already got it started in theory through the other parts of it. But the point is, because I'm using a slightly heavier weight to compensate for the shift, it's going to give the same muscle fiber growth. It's going to allow me to lift more weight, same muscle fiber growth, maybe a hair more, but arguably, because I'm I'm not adding more muscles to the work, I'm simply giving myself a leverage advantage. I'm probably not going to be able to stimulate more growth, but I am going to do so with safer on my shoulders. I'm going to have less chance of injury, even with a slightly heavier weight. So in that case, it really is neutral. You're not lifting more weight, but getting less muscle fiber stimulation, because you're lifting heavier because of the leverage advantage. But because I haven't trimmed out range of motion, I'm not losing muscle fiber activation either. So that one's pretty much neutral, and that's fine, because there's nothing wrong with that. You're still going to get stronger. You're still activating the same muscle fibers. You're just not having to do so in an inefficient manner with poor bar paths, right? And having to use more compensation. Other ways do add more muscle growth. I'll give you a perfect example. Let's talk about a high bar versus a low bar squat. Because the low bar squat does slightly trim range of motion, but you can lift more weight, but it brings more muscles in. Perfect example, on the low bar squat, as even Greg Knuckles and other people point out, the data shows on average someone who masters both the low bar and high bar is not uncommon to get about 5% more weight. So in other words, if you're a 500-pound high bar squatter and you're good at the technique, and you switch to low bar and you get good at that technique, you're probably going to be about a 525 low bar squatter, right? It's about a 5% difference, ideally. But even though we slightly reduce range of motion, total muscle activation goes up, because the low bar position allows for more hamstring recruitment. In other words, there's other muscles that get brought in that allow you to lift more weight. So in other words, in that case, because you're getting a little more posterior chain activation, particularly things like the hamstrings at the bottom, they allow you to get a better stretch reflex in the hamstrings at the bottom. You are going to have more potential for muscle growth out of the low bar squat. and it also gives you slightly more hip activation. Now, it's not going to change the amount of quad growth you get. As long as you keep RPE the same, it's not going to give you more quad development. People say, why? There's more weight. If you're lifting more weight and that muscle's working similarly, shouldn't it do it? No, because other muscles are helping. You're going to get similar quad development, but hopefully things like your hamstrings and your hips will get a little bit more muscle growth, a tiny, tiny bit more muscle growth. So in that case, we have the potential for more muscle growth by adjusting the technique. So you've got to step back, and when we're looking at how you're changing technique, we've got to look at very specifically what's going on in the body so that you know if you're going to produce less muscle growth because you lifted more weight, is it going to produce similar amounts of muscle growth because you lifted more weight, or is it going to produce more muscle growth because you lifted more weight? It absolutely depends upon which of the mechanisms or which combination of those mechanisms are used to allow you to lift more weight. That's ultimately what it comes down to, and that is going to vary from every single exercise. Every single exercise is going to be different on that, and you're going to have to actually look at it and look at the biomechanics if you really want to know. But don't always assume that because a technique allows you to lift more weight that it's automatically easier and automatically going to give you less muscle growth and less muscle fiber activation. In some cases it will, in some cases it won't. It's completely individual upon how it's being done. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.